Okay, today is October 20th in the year 2011. I'm Karen Herman with the Archive of American Television, and it is my great pleasure to be interviewing Gwen Ifill at WETA in Washington, D.C. Okay, so we're going to start right from the beginning. What was your name at birth?
Gwendolyn Ifill. My full name is Gwendolyn.
A middle name?
Not one that I use.
Okay. When were you born?
I was born September 29th, 1955 There's some dispute about this. I believe I was born in Jamaica, Queens Hospital. My parents were living in New York at the time.
And you believe that, but...
Well, my sister disputes this matter. I believe we were living in Jamaica, and I was born at Jamaica Hospital. I think that's true. I haven't looked at my birth certificate lately to see whether that's to settle that fight.
And where did you grow up?
We grew up all over the place. My father was an African Methodist Episcopal minister, so we moved every couple of years. The African Methodist Episcopal Church is Methodist by form of worship and Episcopal by form of governance, which means it has bishops, and that all the ministers, the clergy, are itinerant ministers, which means every single year they can transfer you to a different place. So I was born in Queens, and then we lived for a while in Staten Island. My parents lived in Manhattan for a while, but when I was very young, left New York. And I actually went to elementary school in Buffalo, New York. And then I finished elementary school in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. And then I went to junior high school in Steelton, Pennsylvania. Then I finished high school in Springfield, Massachusetts. And it was in Springfield, Massachusetts that I moved from there and went on to college.
Do you think that shaped you in any way, the fact that you weren't in one place?
Oh, yeah. Being a preacher's kid shapes you in a lot of ways. It means everyone's watching you. That's part of it. So you always have to be good or really bad once you get out of it, which is what happens to PKs as well. Or you have to find a way to learn a new situation. And it served me well in news because you get plunged into a brand new situation. We were very close. There were 6 kids altogether. And we were close to each other because we were often each other's first and only friends in these new environments. But you also learned how to adjust to a new environment, how to ask a question, how to make yourself at home, how to make the other people you were talking to at home. Nobody else became a journalist but me, but that's how I ended up using those skills, and they served me well today.
What kind of kid were you?
I think I was a serious-minded kid. I was a reader, a writer, which is how I ended up getting into journalism. I really knew I liked to write, but I needed a deadline to get it done. We were raised by my father and my mother, both immigrants from the West Indies. My father was actually born in Panama. His mother was born in Barbados, where my mother was born. So they immigrated to this country in the 1950s, and they raised children in the way that immigrants often raise children, which is you better succeed. There was this sense of you will go to college, there's no choice about them in the matter, and you will excel. And we all did in different ways, but that shaped very much who you were and what you were allowed to do. And also being raised in a pretty strict conservative religious household, you didn't take a lot of chances. You didn't really want to get in trouble, and my parents were pretty stern disciplinarians. So that all shaped who I was. Now, a lot of kids with that upbringing end up rebelling at some point. I didn't really rebel. I pretty much stuck to it. And I took in what I saw very seriously. I took in the assassinations of presidents very seriously. I watched, my father would sit us down in front of the news, and we would watch the news, and he would explain to us why it mattered, not just that he did it. He would go and march in civil rights marches, and we understood the connection between what was happening in the civil rights movement to what might happen to us in our lives. So I had my mischievous times, but I was really a pretty serious kid.
You said that your father sat you down in front of the news. Is that every day, or?
Oh, every day. We would watch the news in the morning, the Today Show, usually. We would read 2 newspapers. We'd read usually an evening newspaper every single day, and we would watch the news at night. We were a Huntley-Brinkley family. We sat and we watched Chet, and we watched David, and we were very engaged in what was unfolding. Now, I grew up, because I was born in 1955, I came of age being aware of news in the 60s. So we were watching civil rights marches and space shots and assassinations and war all unfold in black and white on our little TV set. So I was very conscious of the world being this incredibly crazed place that demanded explanation. And I'm convinced that's how I got into journalism.
Did you know what you wanted to be when you grew up?
I knew by the age of 9. I wanted to be a journalist because I liked to write. I liked asking questions. I imagined that people would answer them, which sometimes it's true and sometimes it's not, as it turns out. And I really liked the idea of being on the front row and demanding an answer and watching it happen as it happened. All of these things I saw people do on television, but I have to say I didn't see a whole lot of people who looked like me doing it on television. So there was one woman named Melba Tolliver, and she was great because I would look at her and she was this black woman with a big afro. I'd never seen anything like it. And I thought to myself, oh, okay, I didn't want to be on television, but I liked the idea that somebody was there asking. And years later I met her and I was blown away, and I don't think she understood why. It's because she was the only image I have of someone doing what I wanted to do. And to this day, when young black girls come to me and say, oh, I could do that, what you're doing, I feel like I'm passing that on. It's kind of paying it forward in a way. So yeah, I wanted to write, and I needed a deadline. I liked bylines in newspapers. I liked the smell of a newspaper. I liked holding it in my hand and the access it would give me to getting those questions answered.
Were there particular topics that you particularly wanted to find out more about?
No, I had pretty broad interest. I wasn't interested in politics, for instance, until many years after I started in the business. I just wanted to write. I wanted to have a piece of it. And so I had a broad idea of the things that I could do and say, and the questions I could ask. My first job in newspapers was writing about food, not because I was interested in food writing or because I knew how to cook. I didn't know any of those things, but it gave me a chance to write and to get published and get a byline. So that was interesting to me. And those things to me, it was just an entree, and that stayed that way.
You went to Simmons College, right?
I did.
What did you major in?
I majored in communications. Simmons is a women's college in Boston, fairly small college, and I mostly chose Simmons because I wanted to go not too far from home, but not too close. It was about 90 miles away from Springfield. I liked the idea of going to a women's college, even though I didn't set out to do it. But I figured as long as it was in Boston, I could still get out and meet boys, which we did a lot. So now I look back on it in a way that I didn't appreciate it at the time, and I realized that going to a college like Simmons taught me a lot about assertiveness and how in a classroom where there were only other women, you weren't spending your time trying to be cute or showing off or worse, sitting back and letting the boys take the lead. Women were in the lead. And that taught me things I didn't realize at the time about assertiveness and about how to, sure, I belong in this room. Sure, I'm supposed to be there. And now I'm very interested in raising new generations of girls and women who feel the same way.
So when you got out into the real world, so to speak, did you feel all of a sudden that it's not really like that?
I felt that way on lots of different levels. When you get, don't think we were that protected. One thing about growing up an African American child in this country is you're fairly clear what the limitations are that other people are placing on you. You're fairly clear about the idea that people think you can't achieve, and you get used to being underestimated. The good news is when you're underestimated, you can always exceed people's expectations and therefore get sometimes rewards for things which are fairly ordinary. I got my first job by exceeding expectations. I've probably gotten every job since then in some respects because of it. But rather than spending a lot of time saying, isn't it terrible the way they treat me, or gee, I bet I would have gotten that job if I weren't a woman, that's not something I can change. So I think that's actually kind of a limiting way of looking at the world. Instead, you look at it and say, okay, this is the way it is. How do I get around that, get through it, surprise them? And that's what I do.
And as you started to make your way into journalism, can you talk a little bit about the work that you did in print journalism?
Well, I was very curious. I wanted to write about whatever they let me write about. And when I got, my first job was writing about food. My second job was covering the school system in Boston, which at the time was at the very end of the busing crisis and lots of racial tensions. And I didn't realize at the time that I was covering my first political story, because it was then that I discovered that politics determined whether kids got to go to school or not. Politics determined whether people could live side by side or not, because decisions were being made at the Boston School Committee that affected many, many people's lives. And to this day, I still want to do stories that affect people's lives, that is not just about people talking. But I didn't cover my first campaign, my real political campaign, until I went to work in Baltimore at the Baltimore Evening Sun. And that was the first time I covered City Hall and covered the State House and really got a sense of dealing with politicians. That sticks with me till the day, because people are always shocked when I say I like politicians. It's because most of the ones I've met over the years are people who are trying to represent the people who elected them. They're honorable people. And so that's where I learned that lesson. So I worked in Baltimore, then I went to the Washington Post. Worked at the Washington Post for 7 years, covering my first presidential campaign there, which was I was the low person on the totem pole. So they sent me out all the time to cover whoever it looks like they might lose. So it got to the point where if I showed up at a candidate's event, the candidate would go, "Oh no," because they assumed I was there to watch their career implode, which often was the case. So I covered Bob Dole and Dick Hephardt, and I covered people who, looking back now, it's impossible to imagine that they thought they could be president. And then the last person standing, other than the nominee for president that year, the nominee was Michael Dukakis. But before he got the nomination, Jesse Jackson was running his second campaign for president, and he stayed in the campaign all the way through the August convention. So I stayed with him. So I covered Jesse Jackson.
In the comments, do you think Jesse Jackson ever even had a chance?
The most disorganized, exhilarating, inventive campaign ever, because he would just show up places and could attract crowds. I discovered his crowds were not so different from the crowds of the conservative preacher in the race, who was Pat Robertson that year, because they were still speaking to underrepresented populations. That year they called it the moral majority. Jesse Jackson was speaking to a completely different Rainbow Coalition liberal crowd, but there was a lot of overlap that I think a lot of people missed that I got because I was a preacher's kid and I recognized who these people were. So that's another thing about my career, which is I grew up in a way that allowed me to have sensitivities and be exposed and bring what I call a veil of experience to stories that other people just weren't raised that way. People who were raised in the suburbs and went to Ivy League schools and were protected didn't know what it was to live, as we did for a short time, in a public housing project. They didn't recognize who these people were, and I knew who those people were because they were me. And so as a result, I had kind of an instinct to recognize the people I was talking to. I loved covering politics and presidential politics, not so much because of the candidates, because of the people it allowed me to talk to.
How were you able to communicate that as a journalist?
I think we all communicate by the stories we choose. I think the real bias in journalism happens about the stories we decide not to do, the stories we don't see through any, the voices we don't use, the people I would choose to talk to in the crowd, or the ones who would be comfortable talking to me. I think that's more likely to bring out a different type of coverage in total. You can't point at and say, this story I wrote with this sensitivity because of who I am. But it did bring something different to the story and to the understanding of the way stories unfolded. So that was my first campaign at the Washington Post, and then I went to work for the New York Times and covered Bill Clinton from beginning to end. I should say from beginning to the first 2 years of his presidency. As always happened with me when I'm covering candidates close up, I was the last person to realize he could be elected. I kind of thought, I met him once as governor and thought he might be interesting. I had no idea how much he would be interesting, how interesting he would be. And it was like covering, a banana peel on every corner. He was always slipping and sliding on something, yet surviving in the end. And working for the New York Times, which is a very demanding place, and covering what was a very demanding campaign turned out to be pretty instructive. But I loved it, and that's how I got my chance to cover the White House, which is a good beat to have had, because you look back on it and you say, okay, now I know where all the bodies should be over there. I don't have to go over there every day anymore. So I covered Bill Clinton for a while, and then I left the Times in 1995 and went to work, 1994, I went to work at NBC News, and that's when I made the big leap into television.
Had you ever thought about going into politics yourself?
No. It's much more fun to watch and to ask than to have to actually account for your behavior.
What do you think she would have done in politics?
And you talked about the stories that you did. Were there stories that you did that you wanted to do but couldn't?
Probably. There's always some other story you want to tell. I remember once I spent a great deal of time on a story I wanted to write about a complaint I was hearing from black lawmakers that they felt they were unfairly targeted for investigation. And so I thought that ought to be a simple enough question to get an answer for. And I ended up writing this story, but I wasn't very satisfied with it because it was one of those stories where there wasn't an absolute answer. You couldn't investigate intent. And the truth is, if you weren't guilty of the crime, you were never going to get caught. But the question was whether you were more likely to be investigated. And that then and now was really, I have found that there were no satisfying answers to that question.
So you talked about going into television. What was the first time you ever appeared on television?
The first time I ever appeared on television, I was in Baltimore, and there was a public television show called Maryland News Wrap. And the producer was a guy named Everett Marshburn, who's now at a PBS station in Milwaukee. I talked to him just the other day. And I was at the time covering the State House, and it was just like Washington Week is now. It was a mini roundtable, 4 reporters and a moderator talking about what had happened that week, except in the state capitol. And around the country, there are a lot of, I call them mini Washington Week programs like that. And they're usually paired with Washington Week. And I was terrified. I had no idea that this was anything I wanted to do or was interested in. I discovered being on television meant I got my phone calls returned more quickly. And so I thought it was useful in that way. But I did that, and then when I moved to Washington, I started doing Washington Week in that same way, except it was on the national level as a panelist, just talking about the issues of the week. It was a safe place to open up your notebook and dump what you knew that you couldn't get in the paper. It was a safe place to hang out with other reporters like you who weren't expressing opinion. They were just telling you what had happened. And I was perfectly satisfied to do that, to talk on about my work but not be the work. I was perfectly happy to do Meet the Press, Face the Nation, other Sunday shows when they came calling, all because they helped me do my day job. But I had no interest and no aspiration to go into television.
And then you actually then went into television at NBC.
I got talked into it on a dare, into going into television by Tim Russert. Tim Russert was a terribly wonderful friend and amazing mentor in that I started doing Meet the Press, and I really admired the way he did the work. He didn't just sit there and ask the questions. He dug in deep. He figured out what the answer might be and then what the next question should be and what the next question should be. And he brought not only a lot of knowledge to his interviews, but a lot of curiosity. He knew what he didn't know. And so he would look at me and think, you've had a different life than I've had. I'll bet there's stuff there I can learn. And he liked having me around for that reason. So I think. So when he offered me a chance to go work in television full time, I said, oh, you must be crazy. I'm not going to do that. And then he kind of dared me. He kind of made it impossible for me to say no, because people had told me, oh, there are a lot of people who make the leap from print to television and they fail. You really want to avoid that. And I thought, okay, I'm not going to do that. I'm fine where I am. I'm working at the New York Times. Covering the White House. Why should I bother to ruin it all by going to television? But the more I thought about it, then CBS got wind of it. And CNN got wind of Tim's interest, and ABC got wind of it. And so when all the networks came knocking, I thought I couldn't say no anymore, or at least I couldn't consider it anymore, because it seemed like I was getting a signal of some kind. And so I talked to them all. And I listened to their offers, and in the end, the place I felt most comfortable was working with Tim. He's the one who said, listen, I'll give you a producer, we'll teach you television. What he had discovered, and a lot of people had discovered about this point in the mid-90s, was that they could hire people who knew how to do television. There were a lot of people who could say, look behind me at the traffic up back here, I'm going to tell you what's happening in the weather today, or I'm going to tell you what just happened. The lights are off, but I'll tell you a minute ago the police were here. That kind of live shot. Or you could hire someone who knew how to report and then teach them the television skills. So there was a period of time where they hired several of us who had all been in print and different networks, and the idea was, we'll teach you the television skills. We'll teach you how to slow down when you speak, which I had to do. Teach you how to track so that you can deliver an authoritative narration to a taped piece. We'll teach you how to write to picture, which was really hard. The first time I went to cover a story for NBC, I forgot to take a cameraman with me. I was so used to going someplace with a notebook and a pencil that it wasn't until I came back and started telling someone what happened, they said, well, where's the tape? And I went, tape? Oh. So it took me a while to get the rhythm of doing television the way it's supposed to be done. But Tim kept his promise to me, which is why he remained a dear friend until his passing. He made sure that I succeeded, and then when I had a better opportunity to come to work in public broadcasting and have my own program, he then made it work that I could leave.
What kind of things were you covering at NBC?
I covered Congress and I covered politics. I covered another presidential campaign. This is 1996. And I loved covering Congress. Now, this was about the time they were impeaching Bill Clinton. So we spent a lot of time trapped up on Capitol Hill reading from the Ken Starr report words that my mother would be shocked to hear me say, and trying to get to the bottom of a story that was unfolding but wasn't quite going where people thought it was going to go. And
Were you a big Bill Clinton fan?
have to say the president was going to be impeached ultimately, but not kicked out of office. And so we had just entered the stage in television of the post-OJ era, where we loved court trials and we loved we loved the idea that there was a cliffhanger at the end of every day. With Bill Clinton, there wasn't a cliffhanger after a few weeks. It was clear what was going to happen. And so interest faded in the story. But we had to keep doing it anyhow. So that was fun. That was fun. But I also, by then, had a pretty good sense of Washington. I'd covered the Hill for print. I'd covered the White House for print and for television. And pulling my microphone off. I covered the impeachment for NBC News, and I had covered Congress for print, and I'd covered the White House for print and television. And by then, I had a sense of the way Washington worked. And that would turn out to be very useful because I could almost always look at a story and instantly get an instinct for why it happened, who was behind it, what the connections were. And that still comes in handy today.
But now that you were on camera and also had a camera, how did that influence, the interviews you were getting? Were you getting more access or less?
Oh, less, without a lot of extra effort. Well, let's put it this way. I got more access if people wanted to be on television. If that was their important goal, I knew I could get them. And sometimes, but usually the people you wanted weren't the ones who wanted to be on television. And candor usually involved not having a camera rolling. And so I missed the days when I could just show up someplace with a notebook and get a story. And now I'd have to show up someplace with paraphernalia and a couple of crew members and all of this. And that made it often much more complicated. But you went for a different kind of story too. I had to learn the fact that a lot of the smart, interesting page one investigative pieces are not television stories, and that it's fine to let print to take the lead on those and then find a way to tell it for television, which is more compelling. And sometimes that meant getting out of the box and going out of Washington.
Were there stories that you felt that you wish that you could do had you been in print that now you couldn't?
Oh, I'm sure there are lots of stories, but in the end, I think it's all a trade-off. There's just certain kinds of stories you can do in television that you can't do in print, and certain kind of print stories that you can't do on television. And the two mediums should be complementary, and I think they can be, and are increasingly are more and more in an era where we have blogs and people with their own little iPhones taking pictures. I mean, I think that we are telling kind of a different kind of story now in a different way. So I don't miss it as much. Like I'm writing a blog which allows me to think in a different way than I would if I had a camera in my hand, and that's something I didn't have even 5 years ago.
And that's connected with television in the sense of
exactly. It's all I know very few print reporters anymore who don't have some training in television. When I left the New York Times to go work in television, the publisher was shocked. He couldn't believe I would go work in television. He thought, why would you do that? You're at the New York Times. Well, a few years later, the New York Times has its own multimedia website, which is excellent, and almost all of their reporters have to figure out a way how to speak on television, and they all have cameras in their newsrooms. So we've all become very complimentary of each other.
At NBC, how were the stories assigned?
Sometimes there were stories that you thought of, that you pitched, and sometimes there were stories that were assigned out of New York. Like every news organization I've ever worked at, there was a morning meeting where everybody sat in a room and said, how about this, how about that, what's the best program, who's the best person to tell it. And, just like also every place I've ever worked, some people were in favor and some people fell out of favor. So you rose and you fell, and in the end, the work still got done.
And you talked about then transitioning to PBS.
Yeah, actually transitioning to PBS turned out to be kind of the best combination of the two things I'd done. When I worked in print, I was doing long form. And when I worked in television, I was doing really short form. A long story, when I worked at NBC, we called it in-depth, lasted maybe 2 minutes. A short story at the PBS NewsHour is maybe 5 minutes. And so I had a way to tell the story at length, still with the need for pictures, in a way that I didn't have in commercial television. But I had the writing skills that I brought from print, which gave me a little bit more depth, which I could then apply to my television. So it's kind of a mix of the two disciplines, which has really suited me.
Were there any concerns about moving to public television as opposed to a major network?
Well, not really, because I was given an offer I couldn't refuse. It wasn't only to host my own show on Friday nights, which was a program I was comfortable with, had appeared on for years, Washington Week, but it was also to work for the PBS NewsHour 3 days a week. So my week is split between the NewsHour and Washington Week, which means I spend 3 days anchoring or reporting or interviewing newsmakers, and then on Friday nights, when I sit around the table with the other reporters who've been doing some version of that, we're very equivalent. We can say, well, this is what I knew, this is what I heard, not, and what do you think, and what do you think? I'm not just an interviewer, I'm also a participant. So the two things, and because they're both, they have the same sensibilities that share the sensibilities of public television in general, which is that we're more interested in light than heat. We want to find a way to explain and make you understand why it matters, not just say, you've got to understand this. We're not likely to do stories about episodic trials and missing babies and reality television. But if there's someplace for you to go, there are plenty of places for you to go to get that. You're just not going to get that here. And that suits my sensibilities about what journalism is.
Now, for Washington Week, when you came in as moderator, did you make any changes?
I'd say yes. I think everybody made changes. When I came in, I was the first woman to ever moderate the program, first African American, probably the youngest person to ever moderate the program when I took over. So my sensibilities, which were, I wanted beat reporters. I didn't want pundits, and I didn't want people who were columnists sitting on a high, place somewhere saying this is the way it ought to be. I wanted people who were saying, I got into an elevator with the senator and this is what he told me. I wanted people who took me behind the scenes. So as a result, I would say that we skew a little younger because we have people who are more likely to be out there on the beat. I also take pains to make sure it's not all men around the table every week. I think it's important that everybody brings a different worldview, or we'll hear the same set of facts slightly differently and bring a different interpretation. One of our best reporters, Martha Raddatz at ABC News, is a war correspondent, but she's not a macho war correspondent. She's tough, but she tells the story, I think, in a way that's hard to define with a woman's ear, which I think brings a value at our table and to our conversation, partly because I consider it a conversation, not just a recitation of the week's events. If I'm at home on Friday night, I want to know that I'm going to learn something else that I didn't know. Our audience is already well informed. They know what the headlines are. So by Friday, we're going to explain to them why it matters, and with the people who are behind the scenes. So, on a good night, it feels like you're listening in, eavesdropping on a really good dinner party conversation, except that what we have in our glasses is water and not wine.
Talk a little about the preparation that you do for a show.
Well, this is where my two jobs dovetail so nicely, because if I'm on the NewsHour and I'm interviewing a cabinet member, or I am doing a story about Gaddafi's murder, or I am doing something about the week's big debate, all of that's going to inform my understanding about what we should be talking about at the end of the week. Not only what we should be talking about, but who we should be talking to. We have a stable of about a couple dozen reporters, and we keep track of what they're writing. We put it on our website so people can see what our reporters are doing. But we also use that as a way of saying who wrote the smartest story this week, the most interesting take, the different way of looking at the facts that we can reflect on Friday night. If something happens on Monday, by Friday, I don't want us just to be re-chewing what happened Monday. I want someone who's going to say, yeah, but here is what it really meant. And not just recite poll numbers, but explain why it matters that these poll numbers are doing one thing or another. And so by Thursday, I sit down with my staff and we start to toss ideas around. How about this person? How about that person? And it's often in the end a combination of who's available, who's in town, not on assignment, not leaving town for a wedding or a bar mitzvah, someone who's going to be here. Someone who brings, who wrote an interesting take, an interesting approach to it, and often we have way too many good people to choose from because we have cultivated this crew of really smart people.
Now, do you talk with them at all before?
I talk to them on Fridays. We tell them on Thursdays when we ask them to be on the program kind of what we want them to talk about, and then by Friday I make a point of talking to each panelist so I know what it is they want to talk about. And so that's my job then. I take moderation being that the moderator always knows what everybody has to say. And so my job is to guide you to get that out and then to turn it into an integrated conversation. And so I talk to them with that in mind. But I don't tell them what to say. And more importantly, I don't let them talk to each other about what they're going to say. Just because I want the conversation to be more engaging than rote. When we sit down on Friday nights at the table just before we go on the air, a panelist can say, please ask me about X, because they know in their heads they have a point they want to make. But I don't let them answer the question beforehand, because then the worst thing that can happen is that someone can say, well, as we were saying before, well, that's a sign that we talked it all out before, and it almost always is more boring that way.
What do you think is the most important thing to know about when it comes to moderating one of these programs?
I think listening is the hardest thing. I think people think that interviewing in general is just asking questions, when in fact my great fear I live in is that I'll be asking a question and someone will say something shocking like I killed my wife, and I won't be listening. I'll be listening for the next question. Same thing in presidential debates. I've moderated 2 vice presidential debates, and each time my fear is that between I'm worrying about the time, this person gets 30 seconds, that person gets 60 seconds, and this question and that question, and equal time, and all the things you're thinking about on that stage with the candidates, my fear is that they will commit news and I will miss it. And I don't want, that's the hardest part of what we do, listening to the answer and then turning it into a flowing conversation. The way to get around that is the lesson that Tim Russert taught me, which is to think ahead to what all the possible answers are, so that in your head you then know what the possible comeback is. The follow-up question is so often more important than the first question, and that only is a good question if you're listening to the answer.
That's a good answer.
Yeah.
You were just talking about the vice presidential debates, and you had moderated 2 of them.
Mm-hmm.
Talk a little about that experience.
Terrifying experience. Is the hardest thing I've ever done, partly because of all the pressures I was talking about. I mean, it's you on the stage. Nobody else can have access to your questions because both candidates have, if they're pros, have someone whose job is to try to think about what you might ask, to anticipate what you might say. And my job is to make sure that you can't really guess. And so I'm spending a lot of time with reading all the books they've written, reading all the stories I can possibly get about speeches they've given, turning my dining room table into Grand Central, Debate Central, and figuring out a way to then inform people at home. And especially in a vice presidential debate, you're talking about domestic and foreign policy issues, and you're speaking to the unspoken, which is these guys are only important, or women, are only important if the first guy dies. So you can't say that, but this is really the heartbeat away from the president kind of debate. And you have to find a way to introduce to viewers who are paying attention for the first time, to a vice presidential nominee, who this person is and what kind of president they might be if the worst were to happen. And so the questions are all about testing that. When I was moderating the debate between John Edwards and Dick Cheney in 2004, I remember thinking to myself, I wanted to ask a question about AIDS, but I didn't know how to ask it. I knew that it was just one of those issues that didn't get a lot of attention in a presidential campaign because it was in nobody's interest to talk about it. And so I asked them a question based on statistics showing that the rate of the disease was skyrocketing among heterosexual African American women. Neither of them knew the answer to the question, which was, what would you do given that information? Dick Cheney's response was, really? I didn't know that. least he was honest. John Edwards was to do exactly what I prefaced the question by asking him not to do, which was, we're not going to talk about AIDS in Africa, we're talking about AIDS here. And he responded by talking about AIDS in Africa, because I found out later that's what he was programmed for. That's what he had been told I might ask about. And both of them betrayed to me in their non-answers that this was not something important to them. And for years, I got response from AIDS activists and from AIDS sufferers and people who said, boy, that told me a lot about those two guys, that they couldn't answer your question. And I was satisfied that I didn't have to say, what? You do not know? I did not have to scold them. I didn't have to chase them around the table. I had done my job in letting people at home know this is not their priority. And then move on to the next question. So that is one of the things you think about. How do I give added value to the debate by telling us more about who these people are?
Did you have anything similar happen to you for the Palin-Biden debate?
I had a lot of things happen to me for the Palin-Biden debate. None of them what I anticipated. One of the very first things that happened is that Sarah Palin said, I don't have to answer the moderator's questions. Well, when she said that, I had this moment where I thought I could say, really? I thought that's what you agreed to. Well, if I'd done that, especially in that environment, it would have become a question about me challenging her. It would have also been, I guarantee you, depicted as a cat fight because it was two women on the stage. And also, just prior to this debate, there had been just enough drama about whether I was qualified and I was unbiased about covering the debate because I was working on a book, that I didn't want to do anything to feed that distraction. So I had to once again apply that same idea, which is I can chase her around the table and say, what you talking about? Well, let's, well, like the old sitcom. Or I could trust the audience, as I did, to say to themselves, really? Honest? Is she really not going to answer the question? And let that inform whatever came next. And I think in general that's a good rule. I mean, that in that same debate, Joe Biden's on stage, kind of catch my eye, kind of give me, not a wink exactly, but trying to enlist me as kind of a buddy on the stage. And I wouldn't engage him either for the same reason. So, it's in that same night of that debate, I had 2 nights before I had fallen down the stairs at home and broken my ankle. So I was walking wounded on Advil because I didn't dare take pain medication in case it made me loopy. And nobody could tell, but there was something propped under the table for me to put my leg up on. I came out on stage on crutches because I couldn't walk on them yet, aided by 2 football players from Washington University named Buck and Tim, which turned out to be the high point of my entire time in St. Louis. And I had a lot of support. They built an elevator to get me to the stage. It was very dramatic. But my goal, once I got up,
Oh, are you from St. Louis?
there and got settled, was not to let anybody at home feel in any way that anything else I was bringing to that stage was more important than what they were going to learn.
Yeah, because there was also your book there was a whole
Right.
thing about your book.
I wrote a book in 2009 that came out in 2009 called The Breakthrough, Politics and Race in the Age of Obama. And it was a book I'd been carrying around unwittingly in my head for years, from when I had covered city councils, from when I had covered a county council, when I had covered Jesse Jackson. And I had realized that my career had allowed me to witness a running theme, which is a lot of cities, counties, political power was shifting in a lot of ways, not only from white to black, the political power shift, but also that the people coming to power were the children of the civil rights movement. They were often physically their children, but they were also the offspring in that they were the ones who benefited from the achievements of the civil rights movement. So here we had Barack Obama, who himself had given a speech in Selma that talked about how he stood on the shoulders of those who had gone before. But not only Barack Obama, also the person running for Attorney General, a woman in California, also the governor of Massachusetts and the mayor of Columbus, Ohio, and Buffalo, and Iowa City, and Philadelphia. And the more I talked to all of these people, the more I heard exactly the same stories running through all of their experiences in politics, which was they're younger. They were told at first, you can't do it. It's not your turn yet. They were often told that by many of the older civil rights activists who they were succeeding. And they were told, you're not something enough. You're not black enough to run, black people said, or you're a little too black, white people said. And I was so struck by how similar all their stories were that I would want to write it all down. I realized I had been privileged to witness it, and probably nobody else had in quite the way I did. But just before the debate came out, some troublemakers decided to turn this into a strike against me because the title of the book had Obama in it, that it must be an Obama book. And because I'm African American, it must be a puff piece. Now, what they would have known if they'd asked is that I had not written the Obama chapter at all because I didn't want to be biased in any way about what the outcome of the election was. I also didn't really think he was going to win. I just thought it was an interesting story, whether he won or not. But they stirred up a little dust. Fingers got pointed at me. And I had to learn another important lesson, which is you put your head down, you do your work, and let your work speak for itself. So that once the book was released, it all went away. I don't think any of the critics even bothered to read it because it didn't serve their purpose. If they could have used it to prove that I had bias, they would have trumpeted it. Once they actually read it and saw it was what I said it was going to be, it all went away.
Well, it was published on Inauguration Day, wasn't it?
It was.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. Well, if you're my publisher, you can't resist that. But that just had nothing to do with the content of the book itself.
Wow. Was there any chance that they may have taken you off of the moderation of that?
Never came up.
What do you think the power of political debates, televised debates, are in this country?
I think they are shifting once again. Not necessarily. We don't know what the general election debates are going to be like this time, but certainly we're watching this incredible rush of primary debates where everybody gets on the stage and everybody gets a say. In a way, it's kind of democracy at its most essential. You don't have to have a lot of money to get on that stage. You don't even have a chance to have a chance to win to get on that stage, but you get to be on the stage, and there's something to that. There's something kind of appealing about that. It means that sometimes they're raucous. It means that sometimes they're informative. And it means that sometimes you spend a lot of time trying to understand incomprehensible policy prescriptions that no one's thought a lot about. But I still think, I have this great faith that voters can figure it out. They can figure out who's serious, who really is speaking to the issues they care about, especially in a time of economic stress. Voters generally go for who they think will make their lives better and the person who's speaking to them. I mean, that's what I discovered with Jesse Jackson and Pat Robertson. They somehow managed, even though they came from different political wings of the political process, to let people think, they're speaking to me. That's how Barack Obama got elected. That's how George W. Bush got elected. People didn't like Kerry. They didn't think he was speaking. He seemed a little elite to them. George W. Bush seemed accessible. And that comes full circle. If they feel that you're not doing the job, then you are in peril for not being reelected. So I think all of that and debates, I think it's all a moving, living, breathing organism, which is what I like about politics.
Do you think you'll be doing more of them in the future?
Debates? Oh, I imagine so. But I don't know. I certainly don't know about the general election. That's up to the debate commission.
Who do you think will be the next president?
Let's talk a little about NewsHour. Starting when you first started, it was both McNeil and Lehrer were both.
No, when I came on, Robert McNeil had retired in 1985, maybe. I may not have the date right, but Jim Lehrer. It was the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer when I came on in 1999 in October. Ray Suarez and I were hired the same day, and we joined Margaret Warner and I think Elizabeth Farnsworth was still on the program, and. I don't remember who else. I feel like I'm missing someone important, but because Judy Woodruff didn't come back until a couple of years later. But what we ended up doing, Jim was always the guy in charge. He's the guy who decided what the rhythm of the program was, what the assignments of the program was, how the kinds of stories we would tell, and how we would tell them. And he was pretty rigid about what he believed news to be. And so he surrounded himself with people who saw the world pretty much the same way. We didn't do a lot of the crazy stuff. And it suited me because I didn't like doing crazy stuff. And it turned out it's at the NewsHour where I started to do a lot more anchoring, something I also resisted in the same way I resisted television. I didn't like the idea of being trapped in a studio, chained to a desk and reading the news every night. But if you can find a way to make it work with lots of other things, which is what we do, because we do interviews, we're not just reading the news, it can be very interesting and it can be very engaging. And I never know for sure whether it is until I go out on the road in the country and people tell me how much they enjoy it.
Now, does working with PBS have any present any challenges in terms of the stories you can do?
Not in terms of the stories, in terms of resources. The one thing that's true about commercial television is that when they want to flood the zone, they've got the money to do it. If it's a big story, they're going to spend it, even if they're not spending money the way they used to. And it was routine to just get on a plane and go when I worked for a commercial network. At PBS, we have to think about it. We have to squeeze every dime. We have to always be conscious about whether we have sufficient underwriting to get us to the next year, to underwrite certain kinds of coverage. And the model is very unique. It's not like you find anyplace else. So as a result, we do this, and I think public radio does it a lot too, which is we know we want to cover health issues, and so we get a grant that allows us to do that. We want to cover politics, we get a grant that allows us to cover politics. So instead of getting the old days where they used, some big corporation would write a big check, and we would be for 5 years, and we would be on the air and do whatever we wanted. We have to be far more careful about, kind of just judicious about the kinds of stories we want to cover and how we get them covered, because so much less of our money comes from the federal government and from taxpayers than people think, just a couple of percent. And it's mostly seed money that allows us to get the corporate underwriting that allows us to tell the stories. So most nights I'm still pretty happy that we pull it off, and I don't know how we do, but it really is a different financing model, and that's the biggest difference for me between covering the story, that and time. But it all is resources, money, time, it's all resources.
Are there any topics that you can't cover because you haven't been able to get the funding?
I can't think of one. There may be. I mean, there are probably stories we say, too bad we can't do that because we can't afford to go out and do it in the field. But I don't think there's anything where we say, we're dropping the ball on a story because we don't have the money.
Jim Lehrer just recently stepped down.
Yes,
from the
stepped
show.
back is the way we put it. Yeah.
How has that affected it so far?
It's made it more of a team project. Jim is still there on Fridays. He comes in and kind of does the show on Fridays, and then he does whatever else he wants. He's just written another book. He travels. He gives speeches, and now it's a kind of instead of one guy at the top saying this is the show we will do, it's much more collegial process where we're all in a room saying, what about this, what about that, and we're kind of equivalent, which I can't imagine happening in commercial television. But Mark Warner and Judy and Ray and Jeff Brown and I and the executive producers, we sit around and we just say, what about this? What about doing it that way? How about that way? And maybe halfway through the day we'll say, that's the wrong idea. Let's do it that way. And it's really an interesting model for how to do the news. And we end up most of the time in the right place. And maybe not so different a place than when Jim was there, but I feel like we're more fluid. And because also of our increased web presence, our online is so robust that gives us a lot more room to change up as the day goes along as well.
Now I want to ask you about that, how that has impacted.
Oh, it's huge. The online coverage is huge because there's no longer a time like you asked me, are there stories you can't cover because of the resources? We now can do it. We just will more likely do it online. We can get more feedback from viewers and immediately incorporate that into our news coverage. If we get a strong response from viewers on a story, we might follow up online with another response to the response. We might find a way to engage. We have an entire page on arts where we do just interview authors who we might not get to on the air, or poets. We do poetry. Who else does poetry? And we have a politics page, which allows us to delve a little more deeply into the weeds on the political stuff that otherwise, people go, oh, really, politics? And that's in the science page. So it's allowed us to actually put out almost like a television newspaper where you can turn the page and there are different subjects. And
Tell me in the comments, how do you feel about politics?
that's what online has allowed us to do that we weren't able to do before. It was whatever we could get on the air between 6 and 7, and that was it. Now it never stops.
Do you feel that the online people that are discovering you online are now going to the show itself?
That's what we're trying to do. That's what we're endeavoring to do, because obviously their online viewership is often more likely to be young and to be people who click from their phones. So we're going where they are. It's the future of journalism now is no longer, in television especially, is no longer we are going to come to you at 6 or 6:30 and watch the news and then we're going to go and do the rest of our lives. People have the headlines by the time they get to their dinner table. So we have to find a way to go where they are. Where do they get their information? Will they get it on their phone? We'll meet you on your phone. Do they get it on broadband on their laptop? Well, we're going to meet you there. And we have to find a way to do that in order to make ourselves relevant to the way people are getting their information, and to make clear, and this is one of my hobby horses, that they know the difference between information and news, and that everything that they see on their browser when they open their Comcast account is not news. It's interesting, and you might be able to hear about it. And if you care about animals on the loose in Ohio, you can find out all you want. But there's a lot of other things happening too, and that's what a serious news presence online can. If you want it, you can find it, and we are there.
So that's really exciting.
It is exciting.
But it must mean a lot more work for you, though.
No, it doesn't really. I mean, it means I'm doing different kinds of things. It means I'm writing blogs or I'm doing online video chats. But what I think it really does is open up the world for a lot of people who might not otherwise have had an opportunity to write or to speak or to be part of the product. And so, yeah, it's a little bit more news work for us, but I think mostly it's just a better product for everybody.
That's great. One of the major events in recent years was September 11th, 2001. Can you talk about where you were and what you were doing?
Well, our offices here are in Northern Virginia, stone's throw from the Pentagon. So trying to get to work that morning, I was in Northwest Washington, and it was impossible because everything was gridlocked. Nobody could go anywhere. There was a rumor a minute. There was supposed to be a car bomb at the State Department. There was a plane at the Pentagon that had crashed into the Pentagon, which turned out to be true. And when that turned out to be true, it made it very difficult for me physically to get to work, but I did ultimately.
How did you initially find out about it?
I found out about it on a television set walking out of the gym. I mean, in the most ordinary way possible. I found out later that a cousin of mine works at the World Trade Center, and his bus was late. And because his bus was late, he wasn't at work that day, at that time. There was so much serendipity that day, and it happened in newsrooms too. At that night, we did a Washington Week special. It was Tuesday night. And it was mostly getting reporters around a table or in a remote to dump their notebooks again and say what they had seen. And at the 10-year anniversary, we got a lot of them to do that again for us on tape, and we put it online. And there's been a lot of talk about the victims of 9/11 and the impact and the ripple effect, but very few places did people talk about what reporters saw and how it affected how we do our jobs. We had reporters who said, I became a news correspondent, a war correspondent. I never meant to be a war correspondent, but this story, this moment, so much changed my worldview of the story I needed to tell. We had one young woman who said that she had left the business and realized because she was of Arabic descent, she needed to go back in the business because someone who spoke Arabic and understood that culture needed to be part of our storytelling. And we knew that there were two things that happened at PBS. One is we knew that people were desperate for information. So the NewsHour and Washington Week and Frontline and all of our public affairs programs were on 24/7. But we also knew that for children, there needed to be a place to go where they weren't horrified. And so PBS kept its regularly scheduled children's programming up all day because there had to be a destination, a safe destination for young people who couldn't take it all in. So we had kind of a dual role during all of that, and I think we rose to the occasion like everybody did.
Did it affect you personally as well? I mean, and professionally, in terms of how you did work?
I think it affected me in that I process differently talk of war and peace and terror. I don't use the word lightly because people were truly terrified that day. I think before 9/11, we all thought kind of in an abstract idea about attack and about vulnerability. And for the first time, Americans felt very vulnerable. For the first time, reporters felt like we had to keep asking and pressing, and that we had a responsibility that was larger than just being a reporter and getting the answer. It was that we were the voice, we were the pass-through for everybody at home who was going, why, how could this be? And most importantly, am I going to be safe? For a long time after 9/11, my commute to work took me on a road right past the Pentagon at the point of impact, and you could smell smoke for weeks and weeks. On the left side of the road, I could watch the progress of the reconstruction. And on the right side of the road was Arlington National Cemetery, and you saw the burials of people who had gone off to fight in Iraq and then Afghanistan. So it's kind of, you saw cause and effect on my commute every single day, and that influenced the kinds of questions I asked that night of whichever military expert I was talking to, because the cause and effect was right outside my door.
Wow. In 2003, you did a show with Brian Gumbrill, Flashpoints.
Yes. I think we only did a few, 3, 4. The idea of it was that we could revive the documentary idea. Take one subject, dig deeply into it, especially a subject that was of great... I'm sorry, I'll start a sentence again. I was doing something bad with my arms. We were going to take one subject at a time and delve deeply into it, especially civil liberties issues. Right after 9/11 especially, people started thinking, what price safety, what do we really think is our ideal in this country about how we should live? And we went to Philadelphia and we did one, and we went to Detroit, and we feel like we did one more in New York, I guess. And the whole idea of each one was to take one subject and look at it from several different ways. And we did it until we ran out of funding, but it was fun.
Now, how do you keep your own personal views from coming out a lot of the times in your interviews and your work?
I spend a lot of time on college campuses, and I am asked the question of how I keep my own personal views out of my reporting more than any other question. I'm asked 2 questions. One is, how's it like to have Queen Latifah play you on Saturday Night Live? That's one question. And the second question is, how do you keep your personal views out of your reporting? And I find that the students who ask me this have been brought up on a diet of opinion journalism, that no one's bothered to tell them there's any distinction between saying what you think and saying what you know. My idea is that I really want to keep my mind open to all possibilities. If I make up my mind in advance what I believe about something, or whether someone's an idiot or not, I stop listening. We all stop listening once you've made up your mind. It's because why listen anymore? You know what you think. My job as a reporter is not to know what I think. It's somebody's job to have an opinion, and you can be a journalist and have an opinion. Not the kind of journalism I do. So for me, it's really easy because I want to be curious. I want to maintain my curiosity about what the answer to the question might be, and I want to hold out the possibility that someone will surprise me. And for that reason, I don't come up with opinions, and I don't put it in my work.
Well, you mentioned Queen Latifah, so now I
go for it.
Up.
Yeah, absolutely. I loved it. I knew that Queen Latifah was going to portray me because she had in 2004. She had been the guest host of Saturday Night Live after the first vice presidential debate that I moderated, and it was funny. It was very funny. And then when I saw her, I ran into her. I met her for the first time at a screening that was in Washington, and
that was afterwards?
Afterward. And I went to her and said, I don't know if you know this, but you portrayed me on... And she said, of course, I remember. And I said, well, I hope you get to do it again. And she said, give me some material. Well, right after that, Sarah Palin was nominated. And I thought, I wonder if they're going to do a Sarah Palin skit after the vice presidential debate. And I found that they were. And it was a hoot. I mean, she was mocking me because the whole book controversy, and she was dressed eerily like me. They had a wig that looked like my hair and a jacket that looked like hers, and it was actually a lot of fun. And they replayed it so often that I get a reliable laugh every time I mention it on a college campus, especially.
Where do you think television news specifically will be going in the next 10 or 20 years?
Boy, I don't know where television news is going, because I could have never told you 10 years ago that we would be where we are now, because my recollections, they always tell us we're about to die, and that journalism itself is going to die, and television is going to die, and the nightly news is going to die, and here we are. So I suspect we'll still be here. I suspect we're going to find a way to meet the need as it exists, and the need is changing. The need for information isn't changing, but the need for certain kinds of information is changing, but the need to understand isn't. And so as long as you're there trying to explain to people, why does this matter? Why is it that home foreclosures keep going up? Why is it that the economy can't recover? Why is this guy telling you the truth when he makes this claim in his political ad? Someone still has to be there who has the role to explain. And as long as most people are going to go online or onto television for their information, I think news on television will always exist. We're just going to find different ways of presenting it.
What advice would you give to an aspiring journalist today?
My instinct is to tell them...
Speak.
Advice to young journalists today. My instinct is to tell them to run as fast as they can, but I don't believe that. The truth is, I think our future lies in the smart, engaged, interesting, edgy young people who are finding a different way to tell a story. And just like I was when I got into this business, bringing a different worldview to it, and then informing we old fogies who are left in the business. I think that if we don't have them telling the stories and reaching out to their peers, we're never going to be able to understand what they need to know. So I'm very hopeful. I tell them that there are different platforms, that they should not just try to be me, that there are a million different ways to do this job. I usually don't entertain conversations with people who just want to be on TV. But if they want to, and they don't know what the word journalism means, if they want to be journalists, we can talk. If they just want to be on TV, I got nothing for you, because that's not what I got into this business to do. Television to me is the medium that allows me to do my job. And if that's who they are too, they're looking for a way to spread information and understanding, then I think there's always going to be a place for them.
What do you think is your proudest achievement in your career so far?
This actually just happened a couple of days ago. I was invited to MC the dedication of the Martin Luther King Memorial on the Mall. And tens of thousands of people, on a beautiful day, every civil rights leader I'd ever read about in history books, all backstage, all part of this. And I was in the middle of it. And I had this amazing and uplifting sense that my parents, who are both passed away, were so proud of me for being part of this. This is something my father bled about and thought about and influenced as a way of making his children's lives better. And here I was on stage getting the chance to be part of it. I find that's the platform that my career has allowed me to occupy, which has nothing to do with getting a story on the air every night, but has everything to do with being a better person and being a witness to history.
This has been wonderful. I hope we'll have some time at some other point later on to get some more, but thank you so much, Gwen.
Thank you so much, Karen.
Well, I have a few things to say. First off, in the description box below, I'm going to make sure that her book is listed. And I will also make sure that my book, as well as my course on how to write a book, is listed as well, just in case you are interested. But let me know something. I do have a question, which is, she mentioned the different ways people get their news. And I seriously want to know, how do you go about getting your news? I mean, do you check the different news outlets, or are you a social media person and get your news that way, or do you go by hearsay? Let me know in the comments.